Today we're sewing up a fashion-forward open front spring jacket. This is the everyday jacket from issue 36 of the Pattern Pages magazine. This pattern was included with my subscription to the Pattern Pages magazine, but you can also purchase it as a standalone PDF from their website. This pattern features raglan sleeves, front patch pockets, and bias binding all around the outer edges, which means there's no need for hemming. We'll sew this jacket together from start to finish, and I'll show you how I applied the binding around the tricky corners along the outer edges of the entire garment. The fabric that I'm using in today's video is a leopard print jacquard blend from the Linen Lab. I hope you join me in sewing up this jacket. Let's get started. Here are my two back pieces. Before I sew my center back seam, I'm going to finish both of those center raw edges separately. Once those center edges are finished, I'll place my back pieces right sides together and pin the center back seam. Then we'll sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance from top to bottom and press the seam open. And then before we attach the front pieces to this back piece, finish both of the back side raw edges as well as both of the side edges for your front pieces. Then we can place our front pieces right sides together with the back piece and pin in place along the side seams. Sew each side seam from underarm seam to the hem with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. For each of our sleeves, we're going to fold the sleeve in half along that dart and pin the dart in place. Sew the dart from the outer edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so that you can tie it in knots. Do this for both sleeves. Finish the dart's raw edges and press that seam downward. Then I'll fold each sleeve in half, right sides together with itself, and pin the underarm seam. Doing this for both sleeves. Then I'll sew both of these seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together. Now we'll start attaching our sleeves to the bodice. We're going to place the sleeve and the bodice right sides together, making sure that the shorter side of the raglan sleeve matches with your front bodice piece. I'll start by pinning those underarm seams and then pin the sleeve to the front and back bodice piece. Then we can sew that raglan sleeve in place from neckline to neckline with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish those raw edges together. And then repeat for the opposite sleeve. Then we can press those sleeve seam allowances toward the sleeve. Here is the bottommost edge of the jacket, and I'm going to start applying the bias binding. I've cut my strips of binding to measure 1 3/4 inches wide. I'm going to take one short edge of the binding and fold it to the wrong side by about 1/2 inch. Then I'll place my binding and the bottom of the garment right sides together right at the center back. And I want the raw edge of the binding to be 1/4 inch away from the raw edge of the bottom of the jacket, and pin in place. Then I'll continue pinning across to the first bottom corner. Now, starting at the center back, we're going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance first, backstitching to secure, sewing straight across that bottom edge, and when we come to the corner, stop your stitching 1/2 inch away from the corner, backstitching to secure. Now that we've applied the bias tape to the bottom corner and stopped our stitching 1/2 inch away from the corner, we can take the remainder of the bias tape and fold it diagonally from where our stitching stopped. And now that the bias tape is folded diagonally here, We'll take the rest of the bias tape once again and fold it on top of this diagonal fold, aligning the new folded edge of the bias tape along the raw edge of the bias tape that we were sewing with. Also make sure that you're maintaining the 1/4 inch distance away from the raw edge of the jacket, and pin in place. And then continue pinning that bias tape up to the top corner. Once that's pinned in place, start your sewing once again with a 1/2 inch seam allowance starting from the outermost edge of that bottom corner. Continue sewing all the way up, stopping your stitching once again a 1/2 inch away from that top corner, back stitching to secure. Once we've sewn the binding up to that top corner, we're going to repeat the process of folding this corner just as we did at the bottom. Folding back that binding diagonally from where our stitching stopped, and then folding the binding on top of itself to continue with that seam allowance from there on. Continue pinning in place and sewing with your 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, repeating this folding process at each new corner. Once you come to where your binding began, allow the tail end of your binding to overlap that initial folded edge by about a 1/2 inch or so and pin in place. Then you can snip off your excess binding. And then continue sewing, back stitching at the end of your binding. Now we can start wrapping our binding all along the raw edge of the garment. We're going to turn the binding over that raw edge and to the inside of the garment. And we'll tuck the raw edge of the binding underneath itself by about a 1/4 inch. This will give a clean finish to the binding on the inside, and we can pin in place all the way around. The angled stitches that we created at the corners should help us to get a nice, clean, crisp corner here. And we'll flip that bias tape to the inside just as we've been doing. And once you've poked out and formed that nice, clean corner on the outside, you can fold the excess fabric over itself on the inside and pin in place. Continue pinning all around the outer edges. Now that I have my bias binding pinned all the way around the outer edges, I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and edge stitch close to that inner folded edge all the way around, sewing slowly and carefully around those thicker folded edges. Then we can bind the bottom of the sleeves in the same way as we did for the outer edges of the jacket. First, folding back the short edge of the binding to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. Placing it right sides together with the bottoms of the sleeves, I'm going to be starting at the underarm seam, and I'll pin the binding in place a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge of the sleeve. And then once your binding is back where you started, let it overlap by about 1/2 inch and pin in place. And cut off the excess binding. Repeat for the bottoms of both sleeves, and sew around the bottoms of both sleeves with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then we'll turn that binding to the inside of the garment, folding the raw edges under by a 1/4 inch and covering that original seam line. And pin in place. Do this for the bottoms of both sleeves and then edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way around to finish the sleeves. I've gone ahead and finished the raw edges for both pockets all the way around. Now I'll take them both to the ironing board and press the side and bottom edges to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch. Once the side and bottom edges are pressed to the wrong side, we can also press the top edge to the wrong side by 2 inches. Then I'll edge stitch close to my finishing stitches straight across from one side of the pocket to the other for both pockets. Now I can place the wrong side of my pocket on the right side of my front jacket, center it in place along the bottom of the front jacket, and place it about 2.5 inches away from the bottom edge of the jacket, and pin in place along the side and bottom edges. Then take it to your machine and start sewing from the top of the pocket, backstitching to secure with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all around the side and bottom edges, ending with a backstitch as well. Do this for both front pockets. And now your jacket is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out the rest of my video library for more great full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.